In a graduate level class at a Canadian university, a conversation arose between classmates and the professor on the business behind education. They conversed about the profitability of higher education and outlined the lengths that universities go to promote their image, brand, values, and education on a local and international level. It was presented that some Canadian universities make large amounts of money from the tuition they charge and that they operate like a large corporation or business. The professor spoke up and told the class, it costs a lot of money to keep the lights on in these buildings. Unaware that the comment resonated widely with some students, I felt it only added to the debate on the commodification of Canadian universities in a neoliberal age. This then got me thinking about how I could analyze such a topic and how I would frame it. I needed to start by focusing on how universities could be shaped as a business while outlining how education has become commercialized. To counter these ideas, I needed to focus on how these businesses operated in a free market economy. This also focused my attention to analyze what the Canadian national student debt looked like and compare it to another model. I also wanted to make connections between Canadian higher education as a commodity and the relationship it played in the global market. This led me to run an analysis on international students and their connection to Canadian universities and ponder why students would choose to migrate to study at a Western university. Through this project, I attempt to show that Canadian universities have experienced a growth in international students, and as a result of this growth, we are seeing higher tuitions, which equal higher profits for business, and in turn, stimulates growth in the Canadian economy. The sheer complexity of running and operating a university takes a tremendous amount of effort and skill set. If I were to analyze how it operates as a business, we see that there is usually a board of governors that is connected to a senate, which has a chief executive office, which includes a principal and a vice chancellor, who represent external bodies at home and around the world. There is no doubt a chain of command that operates at a high level of intensity and comes across as a fully functioning, successful business model that profits millions, if not billions. In Susan Robertson's Remaking the World, Neoliberalism and the Transformation of Education and Teacher Labor, the author borrows from David Harvey's work on the history of neoliberalism and argues that neoliberalism had a specific turning point in social economics in the world economy. Robertson makes the analogy that this relationship could be seen as a marriage between economic liberalism and social democracy. While Harvey and Robertson agree that during the 1980s, world leaders promoted an absolute free market within the world economy, in theory, this meant that goods and services could be traded around the globe with reduced tariffs to benefit economic growth on a global level. Both authors put forth the idea that neoliberal thinking had evidently changed education. Robertson argues that education has evidently become commoditized and that has been silently and rapidly commercialized to a point where it could be seen as big business. If we look at the attendance and tuition rates of three of the top universities in Canada, top three being shaped by reputation and popularity on the world stage, we come to some very general conclusions about how each university is increasingly making more money off tuition, which accounts for a large majority of their annual earnings. We see that the University of Toronto is making $1.4 billion off of tuition, whereas the University of British Columbia is making $606 million off tuition, and the University of McGill is making $307 million. In some circles, these are seen as some of the most prestigious universities and are considered large sites of attractions for students to gain a quality education, which could lead to a promising career in whichever field they studied in. This does not take into accessibility, nor does this ranking designate how each individual gauges their university experience. Instead, these are generalities that can be found on various ranking websites put out by private businesses. In Andrew Rossi's documentary, Ivory Tower, the director takes a critical approach on higher education in the United States and questions the commodification of university education. He analyzes the profits that universities are making off tuition and showcases there has been a dramatic increase since the 1980s. He does this by outlining that tuition prices have skyrocketed nearly 1,220%. In his documentary, he puts forth the idea that there's been an arms race for higher education which has allowed American universities to operate in a free market industry that is pitted in competition and breeds billions in profit. While there are many examples of how the United States can be considered similar to that of their neighbor of the North, they share the longest border in the world, they have similar democratic systems, they've both gone to war together, and have over 100 years' experience with trading resources and goods and services. Throughout his work on the relationship between Canada and their neighbors to the south, Canadian scholar Norman Hilmer spent years analyzing the economic, social, and political connections the two countries have while spinning the arguments that the ties between the two countries and peoples are shaped by their differences as well as their similarities, and by competition, not cooperation, and that Canadians and Americans are similar to each other in so many ways and bound together so many ties. They resemble a married couple who must take each other for better or for worse. While borrowing this approach, it could be seen how universities in both Canada and the US operate in similar yet different fashions. There are the obvious few factors to take into consideration when comparing them. Population in Canada is 37 million, while the US is 327 million, thus showcasing that more people could potentially attend university. There is then the amount of universities and college within each country. In Canada, there are nearly 300 universities and colleges, and in the US, there are 5,300. These numbers showcase a staggering difference. However, one thing that is closely related is that they operate in a similar fashion. They both conduct themselves in globally competitive markets and provide students with higher education. I think it is important we look at a few similarities and differences here. First, it is important to analyze the correlation between higher education tuition rates and that of student debt. In the United States, Rossi points out that the national student debt has now surpassed credit card debt and reached an astonishing $1 trillion. And that the average tuition in the US for residents in 2017 was $9,650, and an average total tuition and fee for room and board charges were $20,000. Whereas, if we analyze Canadian universities, we see that the national student debt is around $28 billion, and the average cost of tuition was $6,134. This is a yearly average difference of nearly $14,000 in tuition fees and a national student debt that differs by nearly $968 billion. While these tuition fees and accumulative debt are drastically different, it does present a stark difference. Secondly, I was interested to know the correlation between education being sold as a commodity that acts as a site for immigration. In a report put out by the federal government of Canada, it was estimated that the total annual expenditures of international students, including their visiting families and friends, contributed $12.8 billion and $15.5 billion to economic activities in Canada in 2015 and 2016. This translates into $10.5 billion and $12.8 billion contribution to Canada's GDP in 2016. In the United States, it was reported that the continued growth in international students coming to the US for higher education had a significant positive economic impact, and that international students contributed $39.4 billion to the US economy in 2016. It is evident that international students pay more than state or province residents, as universities can charge a premium. This is something that both the US and Canada does. By fall 2014, average tuition fees for international undergraduate students were $20,447, more than 3 times the already high fees paid by Canadian citizens. A 2018 report put out by the Canadian Bureau of International Students, it was reported that the international education sector had achieved a monumental goal in Canada, as it welcomed nearly 450,000 international students. As students continue to migrate from around the globe, there will be a correlation in increased numbers, both in attendance and in tuition. Now, when analyzing these comparisons, there are various reasons as to why international students would migrate to North America for higher learning. In an article on international students attending Western universities, author Maria Calder points out that universities recruit international students for a number of reasons, including enhancement of global contacts and reputation to increase enrollment and to generate revenue from tuition. Students that wish to study abroad generally hope to seek an education that is of higher quality than what is available for them, while also immigrating for an extended period of time to partake in an international experience. Upon completion of their studies, some international students choose to reside in the city that they completed their degree in. However, a large portion of international students choose to bring their newly developed skill sets to their country of origin or migrate to various locations to source various career opportunities. In a study put out by Statistics Canada, the federal government examined the transition rates of international students into permanent residents. It was concluded that, depending on their arrival, between 20 to 27% of international students became permanent residents in the 10 years after the first study permit was issued. Typically speaking, there were higher transition rates for those who came from countries with a higher level of GDP per capita. I was curious to know why students would want to travel halfway across the globe to obtain education at a Canadian university. While there are the generalities that most people could assume, gain a better education, live in an international experience, and learn the ways of a new life, I felt it was best to sit down with a classmate who had recently moved here from India to discuss a few things.
My name is Neha and I am a master's student in education and society. I studied in India at Delhi University, an economics and mathematics major.
As I began to learn more about her past education, I was curious to know the relationship it played, in Canada, and what her experience has been like so far.
So there's a huge difference. I don't think the comparison stands. There is a lot of work that social science universities back home have to do. University of Delhi University is a government-funded university, and it's very high in demand because it's the most prominent arts university in the country, social science university in the country, and you're more likely to get employed and get opportunities if you're from there. They make it super affordable because a lot of people from lower income families get accepted there.
After only being here for a few short months, I was then curious to know what attracted her to Canada.
They're better universities, more profound professors who are doing more research, very freeing because the class structure is really open. They're more like exploratory. What do you want to do with what you're learning in this class?
I was curious to know, what was it like to move across the globe, and what was the preparation like?
I come from a family where people believe in investing in education if you feel like it. So like a lot of my cousins have studied abroad. It took me a whole year to like plan this out. Then you get accepted. Then you prepare a second set of papers and your financial statements and your everything that puts you as a credible individual who's not a criminal. It's as hard as I expected it to be honest.
I was curious to know what her plans were for after graduation, if she planned on staying in the country or moving to continue to study or potentially head home.
The thing is that if I want to do like proper educational research, unfortunately, as much as I would love to do it in my own country, there's no apparatus for me to do it. Actual work, but what I do want to do is I want to continue doing research in the context of my country, using the apparatus and resources of the universities here so that I can feed it back, I can feed that knowledge back there. I think for me it's just been like the idea of being able to explore education that I wouldn't get back home.
I also wanted to know what she thought about Canadian culture.
You realize how dominant like North American culture is. I knew exactly what to expect when I came here because we've seen North American culture on TV for years. What's the etiquette? Kind of had an idea of what to expect here, so I wasn't really surprised.
While Sneha is just one of the hundreds of thousands of migrants to come to Canada to gain a Western education, this is just one conversation that showcased her experience and her story. If we study the correlation between tuition fees for international students and the number of students who are migrating to Canada to complete higher education, we will see that tuition prices will continue to rise for international students and the country will continue to accept more students from around the globe. The profits that Canadian universities make and the economic stimulation that international students bring to the country showcases that the Canadian economy is thriving thanks to its valuable education systems within higher education and the willingness of students to relocate to the Great North.